Welcome to another webinar in our continuing series on Office 365 technologies. Office 365 offers numerous places to save, share, and collaborate on documents. Savvy people use all three because each has unique characteristics that cover different scenarios. Once you understand file storage options in 365, you'll see it's superior to your local drive as well as your network file shares. Files in Office 365 can be more secure and better able to handle compliance requirements because the storage system is specifically designed that way. In this webinar, you'll learn about your options and when to use them. All right, so BlueNet delivers services across all three of these categories. Today's session focuses on initial deployment. You don't have to wait around for anything. You'll be able to do this on day one without any difficulty. BlueNet also delivers services across all three types of solutions, and today we're talking about information worker solutions. These again are not advanced topics. There's nothing power user or developer oriented about these topics. They are strictly what you can do right out of the box today. All right, so here's what we're going to discuss. Our main focus today is on OneDrive for Business, SharePoint, and Teams. In the interest of completeness, I want to make sure that you're aware of the confusing personal OneDrive product. So we're going to talk about that very briefly. In addition, Microsoft offers other file storage options that are not tied to an Office 365 subscription, namely Azure. You can run a virtual machine with a file system in the cloud and manipulate the files the same way you would on the local file server. This is handy if you have applications that require file server style access. Azure files are the least expensive way to store files, and while there's only limited use cases, it's good to know you have the option. You don't have to store all of your files always up in Office 365. Okay, so it's really annoying that Microsoft names products this way. It's sort of the same issue with Skype and Skype for Business. They're similar in some respects, but completely separate products. Personal OneDrive can use your company email address as an identifier, but it's not controlled by your organization. So if individuals store company files in this product, you cannot control access to them. And if that individual separates from the company, disabling their email account does not remove access to these files. The user can continue to use the email as an identifier and can easily change the email address to something else, like a Gmail or Yahoo account or something. So you don't want to be using OneDrive Personal if you can avoid it. All right, so OneDrive for Business is a good option for files that are created, controlled, and used by a single person. While there are extensive sharing options, a lot of control over access, it can get quickly out of hand and become difficult to manage. You get a terabyte of storage per account. And the key point here is that your organization can perform administrative operations. So if you are separated from the company or on vacation or whatever, your administrators can still get to these files, and that's very important. OneDrive for Business is a mobile app, so you can access these files on your phone. And OneDrive for Business is fully integrated with your Office applications. So your OneDrive for Business storage locations can be set up so that Excel and Word and PowerPoint, etc., all use OneDrive for Business as a default storage location. And sophisticated access control, so you can, we'll be seeing this in a little bit, you can create links that are shareable only within your organization, shareable for a brief period of time. You can control over who gets to edit and so on. So it's a pretty solid product all around. And then lastly, you can sync to a local file storage system, which makes it possible to forget, frankly, that you're using OneDrive for Business. I have a lot of products that are synced up to my local drive, and these applications have no idea they're storing files up in the cloud. They're simply interchanging data back and forth as if it was a local file system. So for files that are intended to be used by groups, teams, departments, etc., or where there's a wide distribution of this document necessary in the organization, you're probably in a better off storing your files somewhere else. OneDrive for Business should really be seen as sort of your personal storage and not not as something that you're going to be constantly sharing out to other people. So we ran a solution briefing a couple of months ago that was dedicated to sharing, and it's a surprisingly big topic. Really don't have time to go into it today. So be sure that if you're interested in this whole sharing phenomenon and how best to do it, these webinars are recorded and they're up on our website at bluenetinc.com. All right, so SharePoint is the place to be storing files that have a wide distribution or need to be seen by and manipulated by a large number of people. Your SharePoint is included in most Office subscriptions, so most people are going to have a SharePoint site available. You get a terabyte of storage for the organization plus 10 gig per user. So a larger organization should have ample storage allocated to it. OneDrive for Business, very interesting. We just talked about OneDrive for Business. OneDrive for Business is actually SharePoint. It's just a personal version of SharePoint. So everything that you learn about document collaboration and sharing and operations and so on in SharePoint applies to OneDrive, and conversely, anything you learn in OneDrive for Business also applies to SharePoint. The main advantage of using SharePoint is that you can create multiple different document libraries across multiple different sites, and each one of those can have a different security profile, a different collection of permissions, and so that makes it much easier to manage large numbers of secure documents. It also has an inheritance-based and role-based security model. And again, I don't have a whole lot of time to go into a deep dive about this, but briefly, if you set up your SharePoint site correctly, when you ever create a new document or modified document, you generally don't have to administer sharing and security issues on a document-by-document basis. They inherit the settings from their container. So if I have a site that gives only, say, people in human resources access to files, then every document library in there by default is only going to allow HR people in there. And if I further restrict a particular document library to a smaller group of HR people, then every document stored in that library, again, inherits that behavior. So it's a really elegant way to manage complex security across a large number of documents without driving yourself nuts with administration. OneDrive for Business, you just tend to create a lot of idiosyncratic shares because most people just don't try to put a lot of structure around OneDrive. Not that you can't, it's just most people don't bother doing that. All right, another huge advantage is that SharePoint has a much better search experience. There's a great deal of effort has gone into making sure that you can find documents in SharePoint arguably more easily than any other of their file storage products. It's also security trimmed. So if I'm on a SharePoint site and I'm searching for certain keywords like budget or planning or something like that, there might be dozens of documents that have that in the title or have that as a keyword, but I only see the documents that I personally have permissions to read. So if there's again, an HR document stored in an HR document library and I don't have access to that library, none of their documents will show up in any of my search hits. So that's called security trimming, quite powerful. Another important thing is that SharePoint integrates other forms of data with the documents that you're collaborating on and working with. For example, often there's a task list or a calendar or other resources that are part of the document experience. SharePoint can also contain non-document information. And so when we're designing SharePoint sites for customers, we heavily take advantage of the fact that we can sort of wrap a context around your documents so that these documents aren't just there in isolation by themselves. We can wrap a business process around them. And speaking of business processes, we can also attach workflows and other automation tools to SharePoint document libraries and lists to assist you in things like approvals, sequencing, scheduling, anything that you can imagine a workflow rule, if this, then that type of processing, that's all doable inside of SharePoint. All right, Teams is the place for files that are in active use by small groups. Teams is included, like SharePoint, in most Office subscriptions. And interestingly, it's also a SharePoint site behind the scenes. So Teams is SharePoint, OneDrive for Business is SharePoint. They just have sort of a different purpose and a different front end. So the idea behind Teams is that it's part of a collaboration, sort of a chat-based collaboration that travels with your documents. Your storage is part of your SharePoint allocation, so any files that you store in Teams count against your 1 terabyte plus 100 gig, 10 gig per user. The main advantage of Teams is that the files are part of a collaboration process, and therefore for files that are under constant manipulation and change, Teams is a better place to put them. And then perhaps you'll take the final version of the document that you craft in Teams, kick that over to SharePoint for general distribution. And the idea is that once the document leaves the Teams environment, it's sort of the official version, it's locked down, and now it's time to disseminate to the rest of the crew. And this is confusing enough to understand here that I want to do a demo. So here is a sales team with a general channel, and here we're just chit-chatting about different customers and so on. And there's a files tab here that has a variety of different files that are ostensibly related to the sales process. And I have a document here, a Word document that a number of us have been kind of working on together. And I see here that in addition to simply being able to access the document quickly, I also have this chat stacked up here so that I can go in and interact with different people. Here, Brian Aller was called out as somebody who should be taking a look at this, and we're going back and forth. So it's a neat way to gather input and sort of discuss. Now, if you're not using Teams, you'd have to open this document up inside of the desktop version of Word and then enable the annotation features to see this kind of commentary. And for a lot of people, that's overkill. This is, I think, a slicker way to go about doing that. All right, lastly, we need to talk about administration. No matter where you store your files, you need to be concerned about external sharing. You have to have administrative control over sharing, and most organizations want a mixed policy where some documents are shareable, other documents got to be restricted. So the first order of business is to think about policies. What sort of documents do you store? Where do you store them? And what is your official policy about that? And then there are administrative control pages in the administration portal where you can control this. So I'm going to go and bring that up here. Let me find here we are. And so I am in the Office portal, and I'm looking at the OneDrive for Business and SharePoint sharing options, and we see that we've got control over the default type of link that's available. We can determine expiration dates, so if you share an external document, you can determine how long a link is available. This is fairly conservative here at 4 days. You might want to make that longer if typically people are supposed to be allowed to make changes over time. And so you can see that there's lots of different options here. And then also notice that SharePoint and OneDrive can be managed independently. So I might make my SharePoint site very restrictive in terms of sharing, but maybe my OneDrive, I can dial that down and or dial up or dial down the level of control here. And then something's going on here with my web page. I can't get to the advanced Stuff here is just infinitely scrolling. Well, that's a demo for you. What I'm trying to show is there's another section a little further down that gives you even more control over these things. So again, it's not so much important to cover every last little detail about your sharing control. It's just to make it clear to you that you do have that level of control. And as I mentioned in the SharePoint section, if you're really concerned about external sharing, SharePoint is the better place to go for doing that, because it offers substantial architectural and sort of design and layout options for sharing that none of the other products comes even close to doing. Excuse me. And then lastly, we have a solution briefing coming up on this in the future, but think about data loss prevention, or also known as DLP. This is something that you need to investigate, and I've got a link there that you can use to do a little research. Data loss prevention is about making sure that critical information doesn't leave your organization by accident. So it's really simple to have a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet that's very large with hundreds and hundreds of pages, and there might be some keywords in there. There might be social security numbers in there. There could be credit card numbers in there. There could be certain terms that are considered very important to your organization, and you don't want them leaving the organization. You want to put some policy around that. Data loss prevention is a mechanism that allows you to assert that kind of control over the individual documents and their contents. So that'll do it. Thanks so much for attending, and watch our webinar schedule. We've got approximately one of these a month going on. So if you go to bluenetinc.com and check out our events, you'll see the other options that are coming up. So once again, thanks for attending.